Okay, welcome to the notes on acting. What is acting? Acting is a far more complex art than it appears. It might seem you just say the words on the page, but that's a lot harder than it sounds. We can break acting down into two general types. You might remember these terms from the beginning of the semester: presentational or representational. Presentational, we can say it's acting from the outside. It originates externally through skills like vocal and physical training, whereas representational, or acting from the inside, originates internally through attaining actual emotions and resonance with the role. Let me clarify this a little bit. So, acting from the outside, think of it this way: the actor says, okay, I'm playing Abraham Lincoln, for example. So, Daniel Day-Lewis, who played Abraham Lincoln, would study, first of all, the way that Abraham Lincoln moves, the way that he talks, the way his physical appearance affects his emotions. For example, does he have any kind of disabilities? Does he have any quirks physically that would affect him? He was a very tall man. How does that affect the way that he thinks when or the way that he speaks to other people? So you see what I mean. So the actor is studying the physical characteristics, which might then lead to the emotional characteristics. The opposite is true in acting from the inside. In acting from the inside, the first thing the actor is going to do is study the psychology of the character. Who are they? What do they want? What drives them? What are their motivations? What are their fears? How did their father treat them when they were little? This kinds of thing, these kinds of things. And of course, Daniel Day-Lewis does this as well. He's a good example of an actor who really tries to study all of those things at the same time. But if you want to separate them out, that's how you do it. So the merging of these two types of acting leads to the paradox. The actor must be emotionally involved, but in technical control. So Daniel Day-Lewis has to figure out what makes Abraham Lincoln tick in his mind, how does his mind work, and at the same time, he has to look like Abraham Lincoln physically. So it's something that is very, very challenging for actors because they're not being themselves, but at the same time, they have to bring the truth from the person that they're representing to the surface. So how do they do that? That's the basic way to do it. So one of the major people we talk about when we talk about acting from the inside is Konstantin Stanislavski. We can even call him the most influential acting theorist in the West. He developed the idea of acting from the inside to replicate the complexity of inner life. Actors break down a character in terms of motivation. He talked a lot about emotion memory, the recollection by an actor of an actual emotion to create the emotions of the role. So, for example, Daniel Day-Lewis might have to sit there and go, okay, when in my life have I had a conversation like the one I'm having in the script, and how can I apply what I went through as a person to what Abraham Lincoln is going through right now? Now, this may seem like a really obvious thing, but until this time period, until the 20th century, actors didn't really worry about that so much. You know, they just played the role. They put on the mask and they put on the costume and they pretended to be these characters. But in the 20th century, people were getting a lot more critically involved in the plays, and with the rise of realism, the rise of the scientific revolution, the rise of psychology with Sigmund Freud, people were very interested in creating real, believable characters on stage, much more so than they had been in the past. And so the big flamboyant characters were now becoming real people. And so that posed a much bigger challenge for these actors, trying to create real people out of somebody that was on a script. So that is a basic way of saying how this is done. So Stanislavski said, you know what, you really got to study the psychology of the person, a lot like Freud studies the psychology of normal people, and then you can get to the acting success. And this inspired Americans. So Stanislavski was Russian, but Americans were still trying to figure out how to do this, so they started learning from him. They would go over to Russia and they would study with him, and they would come back and they would say, guess what? We found out some really great ideas on how to get to the inner life of a character. Some of these people were Lee Strasberg, Marlon Brando, Stella Adler, Marilyn Monroe, and many more. Really studied specifically the techniques of Stanislavski. Now, I cannot talk about this without saying that his methods were actually very controversial and still are. A lot of British actors, for example, make fun of the way that Americans interpreted Stanislavski's work because it was so based on the psychological, and it did ignore so much of all of the previous centuries worth of the technical acting that was more flamboyant. So, yeah, you know, it's one way of approaching it. So, like I say, acting is a far more complex art than it appears. Oh, I'm going backwards. Okay. So that was acting from the inside. Now, when we're talking about acting from the outside, we're talking about the vocal and the physical technique, the virtuosity. Even Stanislavski developed a highly technical vocabulary of acting, um, particularly later in his life. It demands highly skilled vocal, physical, and mental skills. The body and the voice must register subtle changes in character and major dramatic moments. This actually waned in influence with the rise of realism, but recently these skills have gained importance in the West. So we're kind of going back and forth. So realism came along and said, you know what, don't worry about the big, bold gestures that the character's supposed to make because that's not believable. When people talk about the sky and they make a huge gesture up to the sky, who does that, right? Is what the realists were saying. But the people who studied acting from the outside said, you're supposed to do that. You're supposed to make a big, huge gesture because that makes more sense. So there was a lot of arguing going on. And when realism came along, like I said, they really wanted to tone that down and make it more natural. However, we're starting to feel like, well, maybe that's not enough. Maybe we need to go back to some of those big, bold gestures and try to find a way to blend it with the realism. And we're still working on this. We're still trying to figure out, and actors still struggle with how to make a character physically interesting and vocally interesting, but at the same time, inspirational from the inside. So if we look at actor training today, an actor's instrument is the self. Its training integrates both inside and outside techniques. So a lot of actor training programs that go on now really blend these two ideas together. You really can't do one without the other if you want to get believable. So the physiological, the outside, the voice, the breathing, the resonance, the phonation, the articulation, and the phrasing of the words, the body focusing on movement, relaxation, muscle control. This is a big part of actor training. At the same time, actors must study the psychological, the inside, pursuing the solution to the character's problem. What does the character want? Identifying tactics of attaining the solution. So, for example, a tactic could be, I'm going to slap you in the face because you won't listen to me. I want you to listen to me, but you're not, so I'm going to slap you in the face. That's a really, simple version of a goal and a tactic, a goal and an obstacle and a tactic, and that's the meat and potatoes of what actors have to define. And all of this is governed by the discipline of studying the acting and how to do it, and of course how to control it so that it's not actually hurting somebody that you're slapping in the face. So let's talk about the actor's routine. The major stages are the attainment, the preparation, and the performance of a role. So the attainment is usually done through an audition. You'll come into an audition, you'll prepare a monologue to perform or to sing, or you will do a cold reading, which means the director will hand you a script and you just read from it. Hopefully you've prepared it though, and you have no idea what the play's about. That's really a bad idea. If you know what play you're auditioning for, the actor needs to study that play so that when they do a cold reading, they at least know what's going on in the script, or they could make big fools of themselves. Preparation then is accomplished in rehearsals, and this generally is a 5, 6, 8 week process, somewhere in there. It's an investigation of the character's life, memorizing the lines and blocking. So they have to do the homework. The homework of the actor is getting into the psychology of the character, trying to analyze it, trying to figure out what this actor wants, and this is done in collaboration with the director and the other actors, of course. And then, of course, memorizing the lines and what they're supposed to be doing on stage. That's something only the actor can do. It's usually done outside of rehearsal. Sometimes theater companies will say you have to come to the first rehearsal with your lines memorized because they don't want to sit around and watch you read from the script. That's usually done in more professional settings, but that is one method. And then you get to the performance. Now, there's a final shift here, and you might think, well, the performance is just doing the rehearsal with an audience. Yes, but it is definitely going to change. When you bring in the audience, that's another technical element that you're adding to the play because, like we've said before, the audience brings their own energy and reaction to the play. I actually went to a play the other night at the Guthrie that was the very first audience of this play. They had just had their final dress rehearsal the night before, They had what was called a preview, and the actors had not performed in front of an audience before, and so the tempo of the play changed. You could tell it was affecting the actors when there was a big burst of laughter, and the actors had to hold for the laughter. They couldn't respond to it because they were in the play and they weren't breaking the fourth wall. But they had to wait until the audience was done laughing and then continue. And it kind of threw them off. I mean, I could tell there were some lines that got messed up and there was some energy that seemed weird because they just weren't used to it. So it definitely changes the performance to bring in an audience. And if you go see a show, if you go on the first night or the last night, it's going to make a difference. It's going to be a different show every night. Professional acting is an enormous challenge and demands highly developed perseverance and talent. I can't stress this enough. My husband is a professional actor, and he might do 4 or 5 shows a year, but it is an immense job just going through the audition process. In fact, some people say that 90% of an actor's work is looking for work because you're spending most of your time researching what play you're going to be in. And as soon as you get cast in a show, you start looking for your next one. It's a very, very challenging career. If you're interested in it, I don't want to discourage you, but I do want you to know the realities of it, and I'd be happy to talk with you separately about it. It is a very, very rewarding career. Otherwise, people wouldn't do it. Certainly, the monetary rewards are limited depending on what your goals are. If you have other ways to sustain you as a professional actor, that's going to be helpful because it is very difficult to make a living at it. But there are people who do, and yeah, so I hope that explains some of the things in this chapter. That's the end of this presentation.